Right, okay, let's start. Right, the first thing I want to remind you about is the way of setting up those Maya projects and that kind of workflow where you're working in one of these rooms, and then at the end of the session or at the end of whatever time you're in this room, you save your scene, copy your project onto your OneDrive, and that way then you can bring it to any other kind of computer in the whole university and still use it. So I just want to remind you how that's done. So hopefully everyone's got Maya loaded up anyway. If you haven't got Maya loaded up, make sure you load it up. So I've created like a little dummy kind of demo project on my OneDrive. So maybe this would be called, you know, your Mars base or something like that. So you browse to it on your OneDrive, right click and copy. And where you want to put it is Documents, Maya, Projects, and just paste it into there. And then when you're in Maya, you go to File, Set Projects, and it should deposit you already into the Documents Maya project, so you should see what you've just copied. You can either click it once or you can go into it, it doesn't really matter, and then go Set. Now, anything I do in this Maya scene is going to, and when I go and save it, is going to go into that project file. And then at the end of the session, remember, make sure you save everything, select it, copy it, and put it back onto your OneDrive. Now, you can save multiple iterations if you want, or you can overwrite your old one. Might be worth saving multiple iterations of it, just in case something corrupts. You should have enough room on your OneDrive to store loads and loads and loads of stuff, so there shouldn't be any worries about space there. Right, so that's the project kind of workflow. That, to be honest, when you're doing digital map painting, you've got to do that as well, and any other kind of module. It's safer to copy all your stuff at the end of the session onto your OneDrive, so it's in the cloud and it won't, you know, and it's available everywhere. Right, a quick recap of Maya. So when you load up Maya, to begin with, you should see something like this. Let's just remind you about moving the camera. So moving the camera is holding down the Alt key that's just to the left of the space bar, and with that held down, you can use your left mouse button, hold that down, you wiggle it around, and that's what we call orbiting the camera, or orbiting the scene. I'm not letting go of Alt key, I'm still keeping it pressed down. So if I click and hold down on the mouse wheel, this is panning the kind of camera, just moving it in a kind of 2D kind of way, moving it around like that. Again, not letting go of the Alt key. If I hold down the right mouse button and move backwards and forwards, that should kind of track in and track out. So with a combination of Alt key and left, middle and right mouse button, you should be able to navigate around your scene quite nicely. It's fairly straightforward. There's not too much to remember there. Let's just create a cube. If for whatever reason you've lost your object, or it's just in a really weird kind of view or something like that, select your object in the outliner, and if your outliner isn't there, that's probably because that button hasn't been pressed. So if you press that, pops back the outliner, and all the outliner is just a list of all the objects and all, well, actually not just objects, everything essentially in your scene, although some of it by default is hidden from here. But you've lost your cube, for example, select it in here and just tap F, and that will focus or frame your object. So that's moving the camera. Hopefully most people can remember that. You can also use with the mouse wheel, you can also just on its own wiggle the mouse wheel up and down, and that will track you in and out as well. Let's have a look at, remind ourselves about moving, scaling and rotating objects. So you select an object, and if you want to move it, the quickest, easiest way is to just tap W. And you know you're in the Move tool because you see this little icon, little sort of pointy arrows. Now, when you hover over these arrows, they kind of highlight a pale, kind of creamy kind of colour. That means you can only move them in that direction that the arrow can point. So that's X, Z, and Y. If you want to move them just in 2 axes, then you're looking for this little square, which is a combination of those two. So if you click and hold that, you're only moving it up and across. It's not moving off of this central kind of axis, just to prove that. Always maintaining the same value in Z. And you can do that for any combination. And if you just click and hold the central little square, that's kind of free movement. So you're moving it off all the different axes in different directions when you're doing this kind of thing. Normally, you want to be fairly precise. So I would recommend, as much as possible, taking it slow. That's the secret to CGI and not getting stuck, is taking it slow. So I would just use the single axis movements as much as possible. If you want to rotate an object, you tap E, and this brings up the rotate gizmo, as this is called. So if you hover over just the green line, that means you're only rotating it in Y, so sort of around its vertical kind of axis, just here. Same thing with X, so it only rotates in X, and it only rotates in Z. If you want to rotate it, free rotate it, you can do, well, yeah, you can tumble around your viewport, which is quite useful just there, or you can click on none of the actual little lines, and that gives you a kind of free rotate. Although it's very quick and easy to get your object into a strange kind of series of rotations. This is why this channel box up here is super useful, because anything, as I rotate this, look at the X, Y, and Z here. They constantly are changing like that. So if ever you want to get it back to how it was originally, you can just manually enter in the numbers here. So this would be 0, 0, 0. That will take it all the way back to the dead center of the world. And 0, 0, 0 will zero out all the rotations. If you scale stuff and you want to get it back, remember that the default for scale is actually not 0, but 1. If you do 0 for scale, your object's just going to disappear because it's going to be kind of infinitely small. So that's scaling, rotating, and moving around kind of objects. When you want to duplicate an object, say you've got it looking, you've scaled it just how you want it to be. To duplicate it, you can either go to Edit, Duplicate, or, and I'd say the same for Photoshop as I say for Maya or any kind of software package, try and learn these keyboard shortcuts because they'll speed up your workflow a massive amount, and you'll feel like a boss as well when you're doing it. So Control D will duplicate any object you've already got selected, and if you move it, you can duplicate it again by doing Control D, and there's one there hidden underneath. But if you duplicate and move and then don't do anything else at all, you can do Shift D. Oops, just to prove that it didn't work there. This is Maya after all. Let's try and do it with this one. So if I duplicate this, move it, and then do Shift D, it duplicates it and remembers how much I translated it. So this is obviously really useful for getting very regularly spaced out duplicated objects. So that's Control D for just a normal kind of duplication. It means it will duplicate the object exactly where it is already, so you won't initially see any difference until you move it away, and then you see, ah yeah, it's duplicated. Or Shift D to kind of duplicate and remember the translation that you did. If you're doing, because pretty much all of you are concept art students, there might now be some VR and CG students coming in, I don't know. But I know the lion's share of you are concept art students. So when you're doing things like, I don't know, I might set you a task at some point later on in the year where I want you to make a temple with columns. One easy way of getting evenly spaced out columns is obviously to just build one, duplicate it, move it the amount that you want it to be, and then Shift D, and you've got a whole row of columns perfectly separated out. So that was just a little recap of essentially what we did last week. We didn't do much more. I also think I did cover with some of you, yeah, actually grouping objects, just to remind you about grouping objects. So say you're making an object that's made of more than one object here. So I'm going to duplicate this and just, I don't know, scale it up like that. Make a little abstract sculpture or a robot leg or something like that. What you can do is you can select both objects, and I'm doing that by just dragging a rectangle around them, or you can go into the list outliner view here and you can select one and hold down Shift and select another. Now with more than one object selected, if you hold down Control and G, what it's done here, says items grouped successfully, is that it's taken both of those objects and sort of put them under this little object here called group 1, and this is like an invisible object. All this group 1 thing is like a null. It's just like a single position in space. Nothing shows up. It's just the thing that these two objects are now grouped under. So if I select the group and move it, it moves both at the same time. But I can still go in and select just one of the cubes and move that separately. If I go back to group, this is called a hierarchy. This group is the parent, and these cubes are now the children of the parent. So when you move the parent, the kids move too, but the kids still can move on their own if you go down into their kind of sort of expand this and see the list and select them individually. So hierarchy. Hierarchies are more important for animators, but they're still useful for just organizing your scenes. Right. Let's talk about scale. Now, even though you can't see it, when you first load up Maya, you get this grid, and there are no numbers. I mean, there are numbers when you create an object and you move it. You can see this number changing as it moves 6.892 in the Z. But what's this number actually refer to? It's the Maya scene units, this number is. Now, Maya scene units can then be interpreted in different real-world scales. And by default, if we go to Windows Settings Preferences, we can, let's have a look. I always have trouble finding this. Yeah, so in Settings of the preferences, you can see that at the moment, Maya is considering the units in space as being centimeters. So I just moved this cube 6.892 this way, and Maya's thinking, well, you moved it 6.892 centimeters, but it doesn't have to be centimeters. It can be almost any kind of, it can be either imperial or metric, but you can make it millimeters, you can make it meters, inch, foot, yard. Why would you change that? Well, it depends on the scale of the scene that you're working on. If I'm working on a tiny little scene, maybe it's just a bunch of objects, like a bowl of fruit on a table, and I'm not going to be modeling anything else, centimeters is fine. And to be honest, centimeters is going to be your go-to. I mean, there's a reason why it's a default, because it's sort of a happy medium in terms of the scale. But say you were going to be modeling instead an entire football stadium. If you keep this as centimeters, your scene, your model is going to be so enormous within the Maya scene, things are going to become a little bit difficult to work with. You're going to get visual glitches, and you might run into other problems down the line. So you can change the kind of working units to centimeter. I'm not going to change it, and as I said, I don't recommend you change it unless you're modeling something so minusculely small or something so ginormously big. You know, if you're modeling an Imperial Star Destroyer, you'd obviously want it to be not centimeters, because those things are probably a few miles long, aren't they? But just so you're aware of what's going on here, because this is going to have an impact on how your images are rendered and how you work. So, for example, what I've got in on the blackboard, and I will make this now available to download, is scale reference. Let's click into here. So it's going to download for me. It won't be showing up for you yet, because I think it's set to release at 9:30, but what I'll do is I'll make it releasable now. Right, so that's scale reference on your blackboard. For the people who can't see Intro to CGI on their blackboard, I've copied it across to Digital Map Painting 1, which hopefully you can all see. And that's in Learning Materials. And again, I'll make this available for you to download right now. So what I want you to do is download that scale reference. And I'm going to load it into Maya, and we'll see what it looks like. So it's going to be in my downloads folder at the moment. said. He thought. Let's have a look. Oh no, it's an FBX, that's why. So I'm going to create a new scene. And I'm going to go to, this is what you'll need to do, by the way, to import this, because it's not an actual Maya scene, it's like a separate object. And if you want to load in separate objects, you have to go to Import. And let's go to where we downloaded. And it's called here, Man Scale Reference, Intro to CGI. If you can't see it, then you might have your import option set to something other than all files. So make sure it's set to all files, otherwise you might not be able to see that man scale reference. So I'm going to load this in, import it, and I got a sort of man figure here. Right. Let's take a quick swig of water. So this man, he looks like he's in proportion. Looks fairly normal, but let's look at how many grid units tall he is. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, in fact, if I take a cube like this and I'll scale it, actually I'll move it here. So this is it at, this is going to be my little, there are proper measuring tools in Maya, but I don't want to muddy the waters with too many new stuff straight away. So at the moment this is sitting at roughly 0. So if I move it up to the top of his head, this is 21 units up, 22 rounded up. So that's 22, let's move it up to just 22. That's 22 centimeters. So that man is not very tall, in fact he's tiny. So it's quite important to be aware of what's happening with the scale. So how do you rescale this guy easily so that you know he's actual kind of averaged human kind of size? Well, any one of these viewports, if you click into them, I'm doing this by the way by just tapping space. If I tap space over a viewport, it maximizes it. So I'm going to tap into this one because it makes the most sense. I'm going to go to display. And you've got a whole bunch of options here to do with the display, the viewport. Grid. Now grid is enabled because it's got the little tick box. But grid has also got this little option box. And if I click that, it brings up the grid options. And you can set the sort of grid spacing. You can set a whole bunch of things here. But important for us, you've also got orthographic grid numbers and perspective grid numbers. You can either display them, hide them, or display them just along the edge. If I go to on axes and click apply, now you can see these numbers here. So this is going to help us rescale this bloke to actually be normal kind of size, which I'm going to assume is approximately 180 centimeters. So I'm going to scale him up. Actually, the grid numbers are a bit difficult to see here. What we can do is we can go into here and we can do grid lines every, let's say, every 20 units. That makes it a bit easier to see the numbers, so they're not quite as densely packed. So I'm going to scale this chap up till he's about that big. Now he's actual human sort of size. Just to go into specific of why that's kind of important, it gets most important when you start lighting and rendering your objects. The renderer in Maya is this renderer called Arnold, which is a very strange kind of name, but the renderer is the thing that turns all this wireframe stuff into hopefully a pretty image at the end. Now the Arnold renderer is kind of like a separate program that sits inside of Maya, and the Arnold renderer was designed to be as realistic as it can possibly be. It's used, Arnold is rendered, is the renderer used on lots and lots of big budget Hollywood films. I imagine a fair few of you have seen the film Gravity. Gravity was almost like a showcase for Arnold. It was almost like an animated film, to be honest, completely rendered in Arnold. But anyway, the important thing is that Arnold assumes that you've built your objects to a correct scale because all of its lights and all of the way that it calculates light and shade operates on that assumption that you've built something to scale. Because a tiny little light bulb next to a massive, great big object is not going to light it up that much, and vice versa. So if you're aware of these relationships of scale and that they are built to roughly correct scale, then Arnold the renderer is going to behave, again, just more predictably and more realistically. So this guy is now at about 180 centimeters tall. You can see at the moment in the orthographic viewport, now it looks like that grid is tiny and he looks like a giant. So we have to go in here to display. Let's put the on-axis on the perspective grid, because you can have those numbers separate for the orthographic, which are the kind of flat front-on, side-on, top view kind of views, and perspective is the more kind of 3D view. But let's increase the length and width of the grid to something more like maybe 50. We can click apply and see what it looks like. Let's make it a bit bigger still. Let's put 200. That feels a bit better. Now it feels more like he's less of a giant. He's actually a correctly scaled human figure stood on the ground. And these numbers here can be super useful, and you can, I encourage you to just have a mess around and see what happens when you change these numbers. It's more densely packed, more sparsely kind of laid out. Right, so that's real world scale and why it's kind of important. Let's just hide this chap for a moment. Control H to hide an object. Let's get rid of that cube. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do after this kind of demo is to build, choose, I've provided a bunch of reference images of rooms, interiors of rooms, and I'm going to want you to recreate those rooms using the techniques that we began to look at last week, using just cubes and just by scaling, rotating, and moving those cubes around to kind of block out objects. This is really important for concept artists because it's the quickest possible way of modeling, and it's really good when you're just starting anyway in general, whether you're starting out just in CG or whether you're starting out just in Maya, because it's going to stop you from having to try and remember all the different commands straight away, and you can just focus on getting comfortable with the interface of Maya. But I want to introduce a couple of new techniques that's going to make building a room a lot more straightforward, and it's going to avoid actually some of the pitfalls that some of you fell into last week, where you had some objects that were rotated kind of off their axes by peculiar amounts, and it was very difficult to get everything to realign back again and be all nice and sort of strictly ordered in terms of 90-degree angles. And when you're doing rooms and interiors, obviously you're mostly going to be dealing with these kind of 90-degree angles. Now, other kind of programs by default, I think games programs work better than this as well, games engines. But Maya makes you jump through a couple of hoops to make it easier to do this kind of modeling. So if I create, first of all, if I create a cube now, it's going to be tiny because the default cube is like, let's have a look how big it is. It's only 1 unit by what? It's 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So by default, Maya creates a very, very tiny cube. If, instead of clicking this button, you go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and you got a whole bunch of different example shapes here. If you go to Cube, but you go to this little box, every time you see one of these boxes, it means set some options before actually creating the thing. So if I go to Cube and click the box, I can change the default starting size to be something more more useful to us. So maybe a 25 by 25 by 25 centimeter cube. If I go Create, yeah, that looks a bit more sensible. But notice this, when you create, and by the way, now that I've done that, I can delete that. And when I create another new cube here, it will remember the last settings that I created in here. So you only have to do that once, but if ever you want to go back and change this default, you just go to Edit, Reset Settings, like that. Okay? But anyway, so when you create a new cube, the center of the cube, where you move it, it's kind of, its center of mass, you know, like its core, is dead in the center of it. But that's not very useful when we want to block out things like walls and ceilings, because we want ideally to be able to snap objects flush onto the faces or the edges of each other. And it's going to be difficult if the center of the object is right in the middle. I'll show you what I mean. It makes more sense to show you rather than tell you in this respect. Ideally, to make everything neat, I want the center of this object to be at the corner bottom of this cube. How do I get that to be the case? Maya provides you with loads and loads of different ways, but let's try and do it the simplest kind of way. With an object selected and pressing and holding the right mouse button, you can select the different components of the object. Now I want to select just a vertex, and a vertex, I don't know if you remember last week, is simply the points that get connected up to form edges, and then the edges form faces, and faces make your object. But at its lowest possible level, you have the vertices, and I can select any one of these just by clicking on them. Now if I select a vertex, I can come up here to this icon and go center pivot. And you click it and it doesn't look like anything's happened. But now if I right mouse button and go back to object mode, now my pivot point for the cube is flush right on the bottom here. Now if for whatever reason this little icon is not visible on your shelf, do a couple of things. First of all, make sure you are actually in poly modeling, because you could be on by accident in animation or rendering. If you're on poly modeling, and if it's still not there, then it just means your Maya has been configured slightly differently, but you could, don't worry, you can go to modify center pivot. Center pivot works on any kind of component. So if you select a vertex and go center pivot, it will put that pivot directly on the vertex. If you select more than one vertex, if you select two vertices and do center pivot, I'll do it up here this time just to show you it works, it will average out and put the pivot in the average position in the center of those two vertices. You can do it with faces as well, so you can select a face and go center pivot, or you can select an edge and go center pivot. It's not the most glamorous part of CG, but believe you me, if you get used to doing this, your life is going to be so much easier. So for now, I want to select this one vertex and center the pivot to it, hold down right mouse button and go back to object mode. Now with the pivot point here, now I can begin to snap my object around, and I'll show you what snapping means. It means it's going to mean everything's a lot neater. And this is the keyboard shortcuts I want you to try and write down for now. It's only 2. If you hold down, first of all, if you select an object and you're in move, so you're in W, if you hold down X and now move your object around, you can see what's happening. It's perfectly snapping it to the grid points. That's what holding down X does. Maybe now you can begin to see how this is going to be really useful. Because now my object, my cube, is sitting perfectly on the floor and perfectly at the center of the world. And if I want to scale out my object in one direction or another, if I know that this is where I want the base of the wall to be, now I can just scale it like that and I don't need to worry about it. If I center pivot to the whole object, how it would be as default, I could move my object here and then line it up to where I want the wall to be, but the second I want to scale it, it's going to scale it from that pivot point, which means it's going to scale in both directions, which I don't want. What I actually want is to center the pivot just there, so now I can scale it like that, I can scale it like that. Everything's nice and neat and flush with the axes. Now some of you might go, yeah, but I've learned how to do proper poly modeling, and I know that if you wanted to do that, you could do it another way. You could select this face and you could move that face along, and yeah, you could, but I want you to hold off on that for a while, because I just want everyone playing on a level playing field and learning how to correctly snap objects along grids and just be neat in that kind of way. So holding down X, remember, will snap to a grid. Now if I'm selecting, you know that snapping is about to happen because the square turns into a circle. Now if I hold down on the circle, it's going to snap in all different directions. if I hold down X and I just move along one of these, then obviously it's just going to snap in that direction. So that's snapping to grids. You can also snap to objects, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I'm first of all, I'm going to duplicate this object and just move it up. Say I wanted to create some steps perfectly, and I want to get this step lying absolutely bang on this edge of this lower step. Instead of pressing X, I can hold down V. This is called vertex snapping. Also, something to look out for is when I'm pressing these keyboard shortcuts, this little icon switches on just here, just showing you that that's point snapping or vertex snapping. If I hold down X, you can see grid snapping. You have a bunch of other types of snapping as well, but for now, we're only going to concentrate on vertex snapping and grid snapping. Now, if you just tap V, actually no, well, sometimes you'll accidentally get this clicked on permanently, and you'll wonder why it doesn't move how you want it to. Just know that that's switched on permanently by mistake. But if you hold down V, it just sort of temporarily switches it on. Now holding down V, yeah, it goes into a circle, so I know it's on a snapping mode. What I do now is click on one of these axes and just move it, and it will lock it and it will snap it to the Y position of the nearest vertex on another object, any object in the scene. Now I want to snap it to the end, just there. So I'm going to hold down V again, but instead of using V, I'm going to use Z or Z, and that will snap it there. And no matter how much I move it, it won't let me go in between these vertex positions. If I wanted to create one sitting right on top of the other, I could duplicate it, hold down V, go to the Y manipulator, and just move that up, and it's locked. It gets snapped there. So that snapping, it's super, super, super useful for making sure that when you model stuff, you're doing it neat. And this is, again, why I'm always saying, go slow. Don't try and do this stuff fast. Not until you've had weeks and weeks and weeks of practice and you really feel comfortable doing it. So that's movement snapping. Another type of snapping you can do is angle snapping. So let's just move this away. Sometimes this can get stuck. This can get switched on by mistake, and it can be annoying. And some people ran across that problem last week, and I'll just go through how to fix that if it does happen. When I want to rotate objects, by default, it lets me rotate by any amount, by decimal point amounts, just like that. But again, often I want to, when I'm building a room or anything architectural or anything kind of human-made, I want to snap to these 90-degree increments. The way you do that, instead of tapping X or V, hold down J. When you hold down J, it will snap, I think it's about 30-degree increments. So that's very useful as well. Yeah, it is 30. No, it's 15-degree increments. You can change this setting as well, by the way. So that's extremely useful when you want to rotate something perfectly and not guess it, not kind of go, well, that looks like 90 degrees, but actually it's not quite. If any of these snapping options get switched on and then get stuck, and it does happen, and I still don't know the precise cause of why this happens, but thankfully I know how to fix it. Double click on one of these tool settings here. That will bring up the options for your tool setting. Now, what will happen is if it's set permanently on sort of some kind of snapping mode, it'll probably look something like that. So it's snapping there, but I don't want it to snap for whatever reason. So I go into here and I look to set snap, and it's probably going to be by accident set to absolute or relative. Just switch that off, and now it's back to normal. Although, as I mentioned, when you're rotating stuff, especially when you're blocking out architecture, I can't see why you would in some ways ever want it to be not snapped like this. Okay, so that's the first part of today's session. That's a recap of the projects and how to move the camera and how to move the objects, and then an introduction to scene scale and why it's important in Maya, and also changing the pivot point of objects and snapping those objects to grids or vertices. You can have a break in a moment, and when you come back from the break at 10 o'clock on the dot, I'm going to run through how I would approach blocking out a room, a simple room based on reference. And then after that, you get to choose which one of the reference images I provided, and then you're going to have a go at blocking it out. And you're going to only use duplicating, scaling, rotating cube boxes. And you're going to do it to scale as well. I don't want to see, at the moment, any fancy schmancy modeling at the moment. You'll get your chance to do that if you know it, but for now, everyone just duplicate, move, rotate, and scale.